Good morning, everyone. My name is Naima J. Keith, and I am the Vice President of Education and Public Programs at LACMA. Welcome to the National Women's Rights Convention, Reimagining Equality in the 21st Century. For the past year, LA County has been celebrating the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment and women's constitutional right to vote. Suffragists began their organized fight for women's equality in 1848 when they demanded the right to vote during the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, New York. For the next 72 years, women leaders lobbied, marched, picketed, and protested for the right to the ballot. The U.S. House of Representatives finally approved the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, which guaranteed women's right to vote on May 21st, 1919. The U.S. Senate followed 2 weeks later, and the 19th Amendment went to the states, where it had to be ratified by 3/4 of the then 48 states to be added to the Constitution. By a vote of 50 to 47, Tennessee became the last state needed to ratify the 19th Amendment on August 18th, 1920. Secretary of State Bainbridge Colby issued a proclamation declaring the 19th Amendment ratified and part of the U.S. Constitution on August 26, 1920, forever protecting women's right to vote. Today, more than 68 million women vote in elections because of the courageous suffragists who never gave up the fight for equality. Today, we'll be taking a cue from that very first Women's Rights Convention and reimagining it through a 21st century lens. So I'm so thrilled that you're joining us here this morning. As far as the day goes, we'll be having quite a few engaging conversations, starting off at 10 a.m. with a conversation moderated by Liz Andrews, focusing on voting rights. At 11 a.m., we'll have an amazing performance by Christina Wong. At 2, we'll have a panel moderated by Chela Montoya, looking at wage equity. And then at 4 p.m., we'll have a panel moderated by myself, by me, looking at redefining womanhood. It's important to note that we're also presenting this program in partnership with the Center Theater Group, and they are helping us bring to light this special performance by Christina Wong. Without further ado, I would like to introduce LACMA's CEO and Wallace Annenberg Director, Michael Govan.
Thank you. Thank you, Naima. Thank you, Naima and Shello and the whole LACMA team. When we planned this in conjunction with LA County, we were going to do an event, and it has turned into a whole day-long event. So thanks for all the hard work. We're really happy to welcome all of our audiences to the National Women's Rights Convention, Reimagining Equality in the 21st Century. And again, this in conjunction with Los Angeles County's efforts to celebrate 100 years of women's suffrage. We actually had originally intended to host this in our museum galleries at the museum, in the gallery of an exhibition that's still on view, though closed to the public following state and county guidelines, an exhibition of the work of Luchita Hurtado. It was poignant. Luchita so sadly passed away not long ago, just shy of what would have been this month, her 100th birthday. But she shared that opening with us, and she had planned to take part in a panel marking this important historic occasion, and that as she was celebrating her 100th birthday had special meaning to her. So we hope that we can have the museum open again soon. You might get a glimpse of her work again before that exhibition closes. And until then, we hope you can enjoy our virtual public programs, particularly this one on this important, marking this important event in history and thinking about our future. I have the honor of introducing, to start our event, our co-chair of the county supervisors, the Board of Supervisors, Supervisor Catherine Barger, representing the 5th district, which is our county's largest district, spanning 2,800 square miles and 22 cities and 70 unincorporated communities. So she is one of our greatest leaders, friend of the museum, and somebody we are continuing to count on in these troubled times to lead us forward. Thank you, Supervisor Barger, for being here to kick off our event.
Thank you, and it is a pleasure to be a part of this program and to work alongside the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. As Michael expressed, this year does mark the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage. Throughout the year, many of our county entities have commemorated this centennial celebration. It is imperative that we honor this hallmark anniversary of the women's movement for the vote. I believe that by fully understanding the past, we truly are better prepared for the future. We must never forget the accomplishments of the suffragists who paved the way for women to exercise their fundamental right to vote and ultimately gain wider representation in governing and elected bodies. I am so proud to serve on a board that is a living testament to this important period in history. 8 years after California women won the vote, 4 women were elected to the legislature. 108 years after California women could vote, and 100 years after national women's suffrage passed, 4 women were elected to this board, the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors. This is a world that suffragists imagined for themselves and for their communities. Being a county supervisor requires a diverse set of skills, including the ability to make a decision when facing uncertainty, a persistent thirst of learning, and a resistance to the status quo. I think that perfectly correlates to the vision of the suffragists. Looking at their accomplishments in this light is helpful for all of us to learn how to be better leaders in our own workplace. Even when we face uncertainty, we can step forward with compassion, collaboration, and courage. Georgia O'Keeffe once said, "I've been absolutely terrified every moment of my life, and I have never let it keep me from doing a single thing that I wanted to do." Strong leaders move forward despite the challenges in front of them, and I am so lucky to work with incredibly smart women who embody that spirit. The Board of Supervisors has empowered and invested in community leaders, especially through the Women and Girls Initiative and the Commission for Women. In our collaboration, we hear from a diverse coalition of women and girls on a range of issues impacting their lives. This allows us to make well-informed decisions about county policies, programming, and funding. One recent example comes to mind. I co-authored a motion with Supervisor Solis that identified unaccompanied women experiencing homeless as a distinct subpopulation. We are now exploring ways to enhance funding for these women who face heightened challenges in their experience of unsheltered homelessness alone. We have a strong female presence on our board and a vocal, empowered female constituency sharing their stories and casting their votes. This makes us effective advocates for the rights and unique needs of women. With this in mind, I must also underscore how important it is to vote. It is one of the best ways I can think of to honor the work of the women's suffrage movement and make your voice heard. I want to thank you for having me today, and I look forward to a day very soon, Michael, when we can visit LACMA. With that, Naomi.
Thank you so much, Supervisor. I would now like to introduce Yasmine Monet Watkins, who will share a poem to kick off our program. Yasmine is a poet, comedian, writer, actress, educator, and organizer. Touring her intimate yet political poetry from Obama's White House to overseas and empowering students from Harvard to youth prison, Watkins' body of work weaves art and activism, exploring the intersection of race, gender, sexuality, self-love, and all things Black girl magic. You can catch her comedy group, Obama's Other Daughters, on Comedy Central, the Laugh Out Loud Network, and their new Shondaland podcast, You Down, every Tuesday. She serves on the Arts and Culture Committee for Black Lives Matter Los Angeles and loves skating for fun. Once Beyonce said she liked her hair. Thank you, Yasmine, for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course.
As Naima mentioned, my name is Yasmine Monet Watkins, and I'm so honored to share this time and space with you all. As we prepare to take to the polls, I wanted to perform a piece dedicated to Black women, a reminder for why we vote and what's at stake. Waukesha Wilson, who this poem was dedicated to, was like LA's Sandra Bland. If you haven't heard about her story, please spend some time looking it up today. Waukesha was one of 600 plus people whose lives were stolen under our current district attorney's regime, one of the many cases she refused to investigate. As we reimagine equality in the 21st century, I wanted to share this piece, dreaming of all the possible worlds that Waukesha could have been a part of had she not been stolen from us. I know it's a touch silly, but if anyone has seen Community, that episode where there are all those timelines, this is me reimagining other timelines. I wanted to imagine a world where Black women are safe. And I think about those who fought for our right to vote, to live, right? Sojourner Truth asking so many years ago, ain't I a woman too? So as I share this piece, I want to ask, how are you showing up to protect Black women, all Black women? So with that, Waukesha's poem. On the 1-year anniversary of yet another Black death, a Black woman is risen, and the voice of her people, she walks in our steps and lives in our movement. We say her name, Waukesha Wilson. We say her name, Waukesha Wilson, demanding justice now. Knowing Black death and cover-ups sound the same across this country. From Emmett Till to Sandra Bland, still, we lift her up and make her visible. On the day of yet another Black death behind bars, on the day that yet another Black woman's murder is deemed suicide, on the day that LAPD rules themselves in conduct, we grieve and cry and then dream. Because sometimes the dreaming gives us clarity of visions to work toward in the waking, and in my dreams, I pray an alternate universe exists, and that somewhere on this timeline, a telephone rings, a mother picks up and passes the phone to her grandson who says, "Come on home, mama," and she does. And she wishes her beloved aunt the happiest of birthdays, and she lives. In this timeline, a mother does not sit by a phone and show up to court looking for a daughter that the police would never allow to return. Lord, let there be another universe without the cover-up, without the abuse, the murder, before the red, white, and blue light signal and flash the end of yet another Black life. Lord, please let there be another timeline where the police who killed Waukesha are held accountable, where the LAPD no longer terrorize our community. Please let there be an alternate universe, and in it a timeline where a mother receives a phone call, and that phone call leads to a court date, and that court date leads to a fair process, and a mother drives her daughter back, and she goes home unnoosed and free. And on this Resurrection Sunday, somewhere I pray a phone rings and a mother goes home to her son, and Black joy is synonymous with the reimagined justice. And instead of prison bars and over-police states, the community is supported and healed and whole. And on this Resurrection Sunday, we celebrate a life that got to live to her fullest capacity. And on this timeline, the ancestors smile and say, "Well done, but take your time, baby. We'll see you in a good long while, but take your time. Take your time." And we do. And that's that piece.
Thank you so much, Yasmine. I could not think of a better way, actually, to start these conversations, because I really do think it centers not just certain women, but I think some of the most vulnerable women, which we know are women of color. So I just want to say thank you for that amazing poem.
And thank you for this space to share. I'll see y'all at the polls. November 3rd is my birthday.
Oh, wow.
So as a birthday gift to me, please show up. Show
Definitely.
up with your voices.
Thank you, Yasmine. We will now begin our first panel on voting rights, which is moderated by my friend and colleague, the Executive Administrator of LACMA's Director's Office, Liz Andrews. Liz is an artist, scholar, and curator. She has served as the Executive Administrator at LACMA in the Director's Office since 2016. Her work is focused on the intersection of art and social justice. She received a BA from Wesleyan University, an MA from Tisch School of the Arts at NYU, and PhD in Cultural Studies from George Mason University. Thank you so much, Liz. And I love that sticker. Voted early, I love it.
Yes. Thank you, Naima. If you are a voter in California, as a reminder, we are all voting by mail, so you should have received your ballot in the mail already, and you can mail it in at any time. Welcome to our first panel on voting rights. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around, turn me around. Turn me around, ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. I'm gonna keep on walking, keep on voting, marching to the freedom land. I want to just first of all make sure everyone is wide awake and bring song into the space, because of course we are the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. And this is a song that was sung by people marching, struggling, advocating for voting rights during the Civil Rights Movement. I want to remind us that voting rights has been a hard-fought battle by many. Women, Black folks, people indigenous to the land we call America, and art, culture, and music has always been a part of those struggles. Now I would like to welcome up our two panelists. Unfortunately, Senator Nikema Williams from Georgia is not available this morning, but we still have two wonderful people to be in conversation this morning about voting at such an important moment in time. And the first one we will welcome up is Daewana L Thompson. Daewana L Thompson is the creator of Woke Vote, a program designed to engage, mobilize, and turn out an unprecedented percentage of African American millennial and faith-based voters in Alabama. She has over 15 years of experience serving as a fierce community activist, political strategist, and consultant. Daewana is currently partner at Think Rubik's, a social innovation consultancy that helps nonprofits, businesses, and governments to engage in systems change to transform culture. Thompson served as National Deputy Director for Community Engagement and the National African American Engagement Director for the Democratic National Committee. Before working at the DNC, Thompson was appointed by the White House to serve as Senior Advisor in the U.S. Small Business Administration. Thompson held a director-level position with Senator Cory Booker's Senate campaign and was senior-level staff for both of the Obama presidential campaign, among other impressive posts. Thompson got her start working in municipal politics in Birmingham, Alabama. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you. It's incredible to be here.
Great. And we also have Stephanie Valencia. Hi. Stephanie Valencia is a social entrepreneur and national leader at the nexus of politics, technology, and leadership development. She is the co-founder of Equus Labs, an organization that is working to create a better understanding of the Latinx electorate and in investing in innovative tactics and approaches to engage Latinx voices using digital, tech, and data tools. Stephanie is among a small group of advisors who served President Obama in senior roles through his presidential campaign and both terms in office. She served as an aide to the president at the White House Office of Public Engagement, as Deputy Chief of Staff to U.S. Secretary of Commerce Penny Pritzker, and as Deputy Latino Vote Director on the 2008 campaign. Building a leadership bench is a core passion for Stephanie, and she has mentored many Latinos and Latinas over the years. So welcome to our two wonderful panelists. Thank you so much for your time this morning, and also thank you for the work that you do on a daily basis to ensure that the right to vote is one that is secure in this nation. So
I'm so excited to be on a panel with Daewana. I feel like our circles and paths have crossed for a really long time, but I've never actually been on a panel with you before. So this is the first. It's kind of exciting.
LACMA bringing us together like this.
Yeah, if only we were actually in LA. That's the thing.
We would love to have you here. We would love to have you at the museum, but we are so happy that we can engage with you this morning in this way. So we'll do a couple questions that I'll ask you and then see what we've got from our listeners out there.
Fantastic.
So to begin, I want to know from each of you, what must every voter know right now as we swiftly approach the US 2020 general election?
I can jump in and start and just say quickly that I think that one of the things that we do voters a disservice of in our line of work sometimes is trying to pretend that voting is easy. And I think one of the things that we have is exemplified, especially this year in a year of COVID and a pandemic and a presidential election where so much is at stake in a pandemic, is that voting is hard, and it's going to be hard every year. And there are people who are out there trying to make it really hard for especially Black and brown people to vote. But it is really important that we persevere and that we find the resources that that we need, to find the local information around your local early voting process or absentee process, with double checking your voter registration. This is a right that we have to fight for, to protect and ensure that we can maintain. And so voting will be hard and it will be time consuming. There are a lot of efforts to make voting a national holiday, which I fully support. Lots of companies are giving employees time off to take time to vote. Yesterday or earlier this week in Texas, when early voting started, and other places in Georgia, people standing in line for upwards of 6, 8, 10 hours to vote early, right? It's not even election day yet. So all that is to say that voting is hard, but it is so worth it. It is worth it every single year, but it is especially worth it and necessary this year. And the one thing that I will say is, despite all of the darkness of the last 4 years, what I hope that this year and this election cycle inspires is higher levels of participation, both in voting and participating in the civic world in a deeper way. We've seen over the course of the last several months how communities have been engaging in public protests, have been making their voices heard through speech and through organizing. The election is just another way that we manifest that civic participation. And so despite all of the darkness of these last many years, what I hope that this inspires is first-time voters who will be lifetime voters, people who will participate in elections and civic, in the civic community and civic mind more broadly, more regularly, because that is how democracy will stay alive and stay vibrant.
Yeah, and thanks for the question, Liz. I think Stephanie has already hit on so many of the points that I would make. I'll just give this anecdote as someone who was in both Georgia, Philadelphia, and Milwaukee during the primary elections and during early vote, and stood with people for 6 and 7 and 8 and 9 hours as they waited to try to vote. I can tell you that most people right now, particularly in marginalized communities and impacted communities, and that's a lot of communities. That's not even just, I think when we think about marginalized and impacted communities, people automatically think we're talking about Black and brown communities, or particularly the LGBTQIA community, or some of these, but actually right now in a COVID state and in a state of high unemployment and in a state of healthcare, being unsure about your health care, being unsure about financial opportunities and economic development, I would highly say that most of us live in a marginalized state in this country right now. And so with understanding that, a lot of people that, what has encouraged me is that they're seeing this vote, to Stephanie's point, not just as a civic duty, but really as a protest itself to what we believe and what we value and what we stand for as American citizens, and seeing that vote as really a tool of our own liberation. And so that is actually how we are seeing, we're sort of reimagining and helping people to reimagine that vote. So the most important thing we've been telling people about this election is that just take this moment and think about the vote as a tool of your own liberation, as your currency in America right now, as your stake, as the literal thing that can make the difference between what changes the material conditions for your family and for the community. So yes, to Stephanie's point, there are powers that be that we've seen. I mean, let's be real, just yesterday, I'm floored, I really am. Just yesterday in Virginia, somebody accidentally cut one power cord and the whole state went blank in terms of their voter registration and voter network. How is that even humanly possible in 2020 with the advancements of technology and all of those things, to cut one cord? It's like, okay, maybe if I was at my house, right? Because I'm not technologically savvy at all. That could absolutely happen at my house. But a whole state system is cut down from something like, so, I think when people are seeing that, there is this capacity to feel as though the cards are stacked against us. And I think that's intentional. And to Stephanie's point, our job is to say, all of that is happening for a reason. In fact, it should motivate you to vote more. And so my message would be to everyone right now, be motivated to use your political currency to change the material conditions of this community, of your communities. Use your vote as a protest for who and what you believe. We don't always have to protest against something. You can protest for something. And in this case, protest for the morals and the values and all those things that you believe that this country should be.
Thank you both so much for that. That is a very important reminder that voting takes time, it takes research, and it's not always easy. It's very hard for many people, and that it is probably the most important thing you have. And I love that idea of it not just being a right or even a civic duty, but a way to actually protest. In this representative democracy that we live in, the will of the people is expressed through the vote. So a really important reminder to everyone out there how important it is to make sure that you have your voice heard. I'd love to hear what you all think is the role or the roles of art, music, and culture in American democracy, because of course we are the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. So I'd love to hear what role do you think art plays in all of this?
I can jump back in there. As a person who's been doing sort of community engagement my entire life, what I know to be true, and I know Stephanie knows this to be true, is that just situating policy, politics, or voting, just throwing that at people and saying, care about it because of how important it may be, doesn't necessarily connect with people. What culture does, what art does, what music does is create, it roots an experience for people. And so for instance, in the practice that we do at Woke Vote, we always say that the strategy that we have has to be rooted in the culture of the people of the communities that we serve. So if that community is vibrant around, music festivals or, art series, or if it has we have a quilting community in parts of Alabama, how do we bring that into the strategy, if you will, of organizing in these places. And so, I mean, it's a rich history, particularly communities of color have a rich history of tying their immediate experience sort of with the culture of their time. So I think back to even, you know, in unrest in our culture, back in slavery and times like that, there were songs that led people to the idea of what was possible. Freedom songs in the 1950s and 1960s. You heard "Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around." You heard "We Shall Overcome." These were moments where the words just weren't enough. It was the music, it was the heartbeat, it's the drum, it's literally that thing. Art, it, for me, you know, I can't speak for everybody, but even in my own life, there's sometimes where, you know, a movie, a song, something can move me faster than having just that, you know, standard conversation with somebody. And I think that when we apply that across the board to political strategy, when we apply that across the board to organizing strategy, when we apply that across the board just to learning, right? I believe that situates people in a deeper understanding of whatever the issues are, whatever the policies are, whatever the opportunities and the challenges are. It gives people an outlet. You know, a lot of people may feel like, well, I don't know how to, you know, write a bill, or what, you know, you telling me to contact my congressman. Okay, that's great, you know, or whatever that may be. But when you tell somebody, listen, you know, here's an opportunity for you to engage in an artistic expression, it's a different kind of outlet. It's a different way. And so I think art, culture, or art being a part of culture, just the culture of artistic development, artistic expression allows us to root the work in a significant way. And we just couldn't do the work without that. It absolutely would not rest well in the communities that we serve. And I think that's even, you know, if you look, you know, across the world, that's the way in which, I mean, flags and, you know, I mean, just the visualization of movements. I mean, we all know when we see a fist, what that means. We all know, quite frankly, when we see a swastika, what that means. Why? Because images have power. And so I think it's reclaiming narratives, reclaiming cultural identities, all of those things through those artistic expressions, which allow us to be significant, which allow us to be intentional, and which really allow us to have value in the communities that we're attempting to engage.
Yeah, I would 100% agree with everything that you said, Daewana, and the power of culture and art to tell stories, the power of culture and art to shape narrative. When we look at things like the LGBT community, for example, you know, and how over the last 20 years we have seen, you know, the shift of how we have seen them represented and that community represented in culture and television, in art, and then how that has shifted and changed public opinion. I think like they are definitely connected. And I think the other thing I would just raise up about what Daewana said is that, you know, when you start and you lead with politics, people tune out. Politics is something that, you know, a lot of people don't want to have to deal with. They don't want to think about. And so when you lead with politics, you're automatically just speaking to the choir, you know, the people who are already very politicized or radicalized or engaged, right? Like you're speaking to the people who are, you know, are probably already going to vote. You're not speaking to those people who are on the sidelines or the margins who we actually want to get to vote. So part of, you know, what I think, you know, one of the unique values of culture is being able to do that. You know, I recently launched a new platform with Eva Longoria and America Ferrera and Olga Segura and a bunch of other folks, kind of merging the creative Hollywood world with the political world for a platform we launched called She Se Puede, which is really looking at, it's a digital first platform that is working to engage Latinas, which, you know, we can have a whole conversation about the role that Latinas can play in this election. They are very, very powerful block of voters if they are engaged and communicated with. But one of the challenges we saw was they were a lot of voters on the margins and the sidelines because they don't engage in politics. But part of us building this platform was to have a conversation about engaging the fully empowered Latina in this country, which is, you know, feeling beautiful, feeling empowered about your finances, feeling empowered as a mom or as a leader in your family, and feeling empowered as somebody who can participate in your community through civic engagement. And so we weren't leading with politics. We have, you know, DJs and artists and yoga and makeup tutorials, but we also have organizing, and we're also tapping into, you know, women who want to be more involved in their community and making sure they have all the information about voter registration. And, you know, so it's a both and. We like to say, you know, making people eat broccoli with ice cream, because it's hard to say no to, you know, Eva Longoria giving a makeup tutorial, but also slipping in there about, hey, have you checked your voter registration? So I do think, like, again, culture and the arts have a really powerful way to change and shape narrative and public opinion, but also in a way to kind of engage the people who have tended to be on the sidelines that campaigns and candidates aren't necessarily talking to, because they're just stuck in a cycle of not showing up to vote because nobody is talking to them on a regular basis.
Wow. Yeah, thank you both for that. It's amazing to think about how different strategies can be used to make voting and politics relevant, because I think you're totally right. A lot of people feel like politics is intimidating. It may or may not matter to them. But once you have something to latch onto to ground you, that drum beat, that makeup tutorial, whatever it may be, that makes it more relevant to you. So thank you for the work you all are doing around that.
Liz, if I could just piggyback on something
Yes.
that Stephanie said that made me think. The other thing is that what culture allows us to do is to champion hard issues in safe spaces, right? And I think that even some of the, you know, work that has been done, particularly, let's say even, I was thinking about how when the pipeline conversation was happening around the, and the impact it could potentially have, or that it would have on Indigenous individuals in this country, that a lot of people would not have paid attention to that. Let's just be very clear, because number one, there's just a disconnect anyway with that understanding. Most people don't even know what a pipe, you know, like they're like, it's just a very big disconnect. But when people who, you know, started to talk about it were people that we see sort of in everyday, and, you know, I remember I saw it in the middle of a BET episode that was when I was like, what are they talking? You know, it was so random, you know, but they knew, like, hey, you know, everybody's watching this show right now. Let's have something that talks about this particular thing. And even for me, you know, it just sparked it for me. And I think that, you know, it's not that we have to agree on everything. It's having a safe place to question and to learn. And I think culture really allows us some of those safe spaces that sometimes politics can be polarizing and not allow that safe space, because you think that people are coming into it from their own particular partisan perspectives or whatever that may have you. So I really appreciate culture, art, you know, those mediums allowing us to ask questions in a safe space and to explore and imagine and critique, you know, in a safe space.
Thank you for that. Yeah, and it's interesting that you heard that issue through BET, and I love the idea of kind of the communities crossing and supporting one another through media in that moment. I'm curious if you all can find moments in history that can provide some context or some guidance for the political complexities, the social complexities of the United States of America in 2020. I mean, a global health crisis, deep political polarization, violence, urgent movements for change. Are there moments in the past that have lessons for our current situation? Because it's a lot right now.
I'd be interested for what Daewana has to say on this, but you know, for me, there isn't any other point of comparison in this world. The role of social media and how that is shaping the thinking voters today and the connectivity, you know, good, bad, or indifferent. There are lots of views to be argued about that. Two is, you know, the state of you know, the world and the divisiveness that exists in our country today. And on top of that, you know, a global pandemic, and a pandemic that not only is creating a lot of economic and, you know, health uncertainty for people, but is going to shift and change the way that they vote and participate in this upcoming election, where there's so much at stake. So I think for me, you know, part of what makes this, there's so much writing on this election that, you know, so much anxiety over the last, you know, 4 years. But in this last 20 days, part of what makes it even more anxiety inducing for me anyway, is that we have no comparison point. Like we're trying to predict people's behavior. That's really what like politics and campaigns try to do in pollsters, is they try to predict people's behavior based on circumstances and their behavior of the past. And so part of why this is just like so gut wrenching and makes me want to pull my hair out every day is because we really have no idea. There is no past comparison point. And everything that we're doing to try to pull and understand where voters are today and where they're going to be and how they're going to vote. Are they going to vote in person? Are they going to vote by mail? And, you know, there are just so many uncertainties and so many externalities that can shift and change the way people will participate. You know, there will be attempts at voter suppression, disinformation that has and will continue to spread, you know, about, for example, what we saw in 2018 was like photos of ICE agents, doctored photos of ICE agents going and arresting people at polling locations. And that was circulating like wildfire on places like WhatsApp. So there are just so many externalities that we have like we are literally in uncharted territory. And the only thing that I will say, which I think you will hear lots of people talk about this, but like the only way for us to ensure that we have an uncontested election and a really clear result is that people go out and vote and make their voice heard. And for me, that is supporting Joe Biden. And that is, you know, meaning that there is, you know, a high watermark of support that cannot be critiqued in terms of the level of support that he received. So, you know, again, I think we're in a new world order. We are in uncharted territory. And that is part of like what is going to make not even just the next 20 days, but the days as ballots continue to be counted after the election, all the more unnerving. Daewana, hopefully you have something more hopeful to say.
Well, no, listen, you know, so woke vote exists in the space as a C3 and C4. So I won't be making any determinations on who people, you know, should vote for. But I will say Stephanie and I seem to have been in solidarity for a long time, and we're going to stay in solidarity. That being said, I think that there are moments in our history that can provide insight and or shared or collective moments where we can learn that can be applied. But I agree with Stephanie that just all of the ways in which 2020 is situated, whether it's through the advancement of technology that we absolutely have never had for some, you know, whether it is, I mean, let's be clear, COVID, we've had things like SARS and, you know, other, and by SARS, I'm actually talking about the healthcare scare, not what's going on in Nigeria, but we've had, you know, issues that, you know, have Ebola and, you know, all these different things, but it hasn't impacted our country to the point of shutting down our country in those same kind of ways. In the sense of like with COVID, we couldn't even leave our doors. I think for a lot of people that was just, you know, I mean, you know, the reality of that for them was just, you know, more than they could really fathom, right? All of this happening in the middle of social unrest and just, you know, around social justice, around what's considered police and state violence, what's considered, you know, I mean, it's so many things at one time, you know, that I think people are having to function through. I don't know of a time where all of those things were laid at the lap of every single American at the same time, right? And where we all had to come to terms with really how do we collectively move forward? I think that there have been moments where we've stood in allyship with each other, right, on certain things. So for instance, you know, the women's suffrage movement, or, you know, even the migrant workers movement with Cesar Chavez, and, you know, all of these different places, it was a call to action for a community of folk, for, you know, a group of Americans or a group of folk. And then then others were asked to stand in solidarity. But what happens when it's impacting all Americans at one time? That actually has been both a challenge, and I think to some extent it's been an opportunity, because now we know across all lines, or we're beginning to see in a lot of places, where people just stand as what they believe America is, regardless of how you present in this world. And people are saying, okay, either you with me or we're not, you know what I mean? And I think those conversations, it's been a long time. You know, I think we saw a little bit of that when 9/11 happened, when it impacted all Americans, and we started asking those all questions, right? And I'm just bringing, you know, these into the conversation because I don't want to make the mistake of, or, you know, people not thinking that these were things that, you know, really changed the heartbeat of our country, or the way we thought, you know, the way we think. But again, I have friends who lived in New York at the time. I can remember exactly where I was. I was in Kentucky. I was, you know, this may say my age, I don't know, whatever, but I was in college at the time. And there's I went to Berea College in Kentucky, which is in Appalachia. And there was a weapons facility like maybe 10 miles away from my college, or 20 miles away, where they stock and utilize resources for the National Guard and some other things. And I remember when all of this happened, they put the entire city, the campus, everything on lockdown. And I didn't even know what was going on, that we didn't even know that there was that facility that close, but there was concern that it could be a target, right? And so even though I wasn't in New York, and I was, you know, literally looking with horror at what was going on, I became a target myself. And you know, it just, so there was this joint and collective fear, a collective sense of how do we take care of each other. And I think that there are moments that we can look to in history where we felt that as all Americans. And I think we're in that moment right now. And so I say all of that hopefully to say that social media, digital, you know, all of that has allowed us, if nothing else, to be in a collective moment and to have a conversation about who we are and what we're doing. And I think that, and who we want to be projected to the world. And I think that's the other part of all of this that is interesting, is that a lot of our, outside of like 9/11 and some of the other things, the world kind of looked in on America and was like, oh man, civil rights is horrible. And it became, you know, a litmus test for rights in South Africa and all those other kinds of things. People kind of looked at what was going on with the LGBT community and saying, that's horrible. And it became a litmus for how things happen in different countries. People looked at, you know, how we treat our women, how we treat, you know, how we looked at education, how we looked at economic opportunity, how we looked at immigration. And it became, you know, a conversation for the world. But now, over the last couple of years, we haven't become a conversation for the standard. We've been a conversation of what not to do. And I think that, you know, in this moment, it really is about who we are and who we want to be to the world and who we want to be as Americans. And I think it's been a long time since we've been in that shared communal space together.
Wow. Yeah, this really is, I was hoping you all would have an example, something to say, yes, we can learn from, you know, this thing, but, you know, it sounds like what a lot of people I've heard trying to do piece together lessons from 9/11, from the civil rights movement, from so many things, because we really are in a moment that is unlike anything else, as you both brought up with social media. And so thank you for the work you do and navigating these uncharted territory, these waters that are just really complex. And and so necessary. I remember watching a public program toward the beginning of the pandemic with Franklin Sermons, who is a former curator at LACMA and currently the director of the Perez Art Museum in Miami. And he said, I remember being in college and reading about the civil rights movement and being like, oh, I kind of wish I was around during that time. Like that would have been a much more important time to be alive. And it's like, well, 2020 has arrived and your time is here. And it's time for new trailblazers. And so thank you for helping us try to figure out what our path is forward collectively as Americans and what our values are. I want to turn to some of the questions that have come in from people who are watching right now. This one I thought was really interesting. Wondering what you all think about making voting mandatory, like in Australia.
Well, I certainly think that in places, the place I'm more familiar with is, for example, a place like Puerto Rico, the island of Puerto Rico, which is a US territory, not a foreign country. Just to clarify, because sometimes people get confused. But on the island of Puerto Rico, one of the things that's really interesting is they have, when we talk about culture and emerging culture, they have really shifted the way that they look at civic engagement. Election day is a holiday. People who are incarcerated can vote from jail. You also have a very cultural experience to voting. It is a celebratory experience. They have what are called caravanas, which are like trucks that go through neighborhoods, reminding people, playing loud music and dancing in the streets, reminding people it's a celebration and, it's an honor to participate. And as a result, you see very high levels of participation among, Puerto Ricans on the island. What's fascinating is when they come to the mainland, when they move to a place like Florida or New York, their participation rates drop. We've done a lot of studying about why that actually is, but I think that a lot has to do again with the kind of broader kind of culture change that has been accomplished there, both in making it a federal holiday, making it inserting cultural moments into the process and changing the way people think about like actually voting and what it means to participate in civic society.
Yeah, oh, I love that, Stephanie. So I have actually had the wonderful opportunity to work on elections in several different countries as a part of my experience. And what has always struck me about that is for instance, I worked in Ghana, West Africa for their presidential election several years ago, and the country votes at about 93% of the country. Now, I understand that, Ghana is smaller than, America. However, just 93% of, like I was like, wait, what? When we were doing our research and learning, I'm like, 93, what? And I asked so many times, and it was always the same answer. Why is this the case? What motivates the high turnout? Because let's be very clear, at that time and even now, the process of voting is much more difficult than it is here in America. People stand in line in the heat. They fingerprint themselves. There's a whole, it's a different thing. But they stay in that line and they think through that, and I was wondering, I was like, why, what is the motivating factor? And I would ask, the local leaders and a lot of the local people in the community, and they said, I remember a woman told me from the Voltaire region, she said, literally, if I vote for the wrong person, my kids won't eat. She felt like it was that connected to her ability to take care of her family, right? I feel that way with my vote, but I know that there's not a lot of people, or there is a disconnect sometimes between our votes and our ability to actually exist and what that does for us. And I remember, I will never forget she said that. And everybody that I talked to had similar understanding of like, we have to vote because whoever gets in leadership literally makes the decisions that will change my ability to do X, Y, and Z and show up more significantly or less significantly for me. I remember being in Trinidad and Tobago, and it was the same thing. Turnout was like 90 in the 90th percentile for the prime minister election. And I remember asking the same conversation. It was like, listen, under the last situation, you know, we had this, and this, and the people didn't turn out. So we got to do this to get the people turned out. And I think it's why I also like municipal politics probably more than I like federal politics here. And the reason why I say that is because, you know, with your mayor and your city council and your school board and your local police chief and, you know, all of that, people can kind of understand and see the immediate impact of government, right? They see how those roles play out in their everyday experience. You know, if you've got a aggressive, you know, city council, maybe they're bringing in business and, you know, bringing in opportunities. If you don't, you know, one thing or the other, people kind of see it a little bit, you know, closer. I think sometimes with federal politics, people don't see that. And so what I would say is this: mandatory might be a little bit of a push for us, just, you know, as a collective. But what I will say, and I think Stephanie alluded to this earlier, is that any effort that we can make to make voting as simple as possible so that people are not having to make a decision about whether or not to vote, you know, I could see something like, why can't we vote from home, right? Like just those kinds of things. Why can't we imagine that? Why can't we, you know, we do everything else from home. We order online, we do the census, we do everything else from home, pay our bills. You can go to school online, you know, all those things. Why can't we vote from home? And I think if we start asking the questions about how we open the voting opportunity versus, you know, what's restricting us, or, you know, what are the things that are restricting the voting opportunity, I think that can probably get us to where we need to be. I just don't see us ever going to a mandatory voting model, just given the context of how we exist as a country.
Anything else you'd like to add, Stephanie? All right. I appreciate you all bringing in examples and insight from other countries, because I think sometimes it feels like we are in a complete silo here in the United States of America, and we don't necessarily always look outside for lessons. But I did not know that about Ghana and Togo. That's, I mean, and I also didn't know the details about Puerto Rico. So I think, thank you for schooling our audiences on the fact that there are different approaches and different ways we can exist.
PR is lit, Stephanie. I love what they're doing over there in terms of just owning their experience as citizens. I mean, the revolutions that are happening, I think it really speaks to what people can do when they feel empowered to change their situation, and to know that they really are the ones that are responsible for their communities, and that leaders are responsible to them. It's been very empowering watching the way in which they're navigating the last several years in terms of their political experience.
All right, I have a question from the audience, and this is the money question. I think everyone wants to know, what would you say to individuals who are feeling disillusioned by democracy?
Well, you know, I think one of the things kind of goes back to the initial thing that I started with, which voting is hard. And I think, you know, we also have become a society that wants to see results right away, that we expect, you know, we're kind of living in this world where we order something from Amazon and it gets here in a day, like an instant gratification society. Politics and democracy is not instant gratification. Like, it is a long, hard fight. Policy is not instant gratification. Like, just because you elect a person because you believe in their vision doesn't mean that that vision is going to be realized overnight. I think part of even in 2008, I think we saw some of this when Barack Obama was elected, and I was at the White House at this time when he won and transitioned into government into 2009. A lot of people thought their job was done when they elected him president, but little did they think that like part of the work that had to be done to realize his agenda actually started the day after the election and really started in earnest the day he was inaugurated president. And so, it was actually kind of a challenge to re-engage a lot of the people who had voted him into office around the healthcare fight, if people remember in early 2009. And I think, that is something where I think the disillusionment about politics is real. And there are certainly things that there are plenty of things to be disillusioned about. The role of money in politics, who has power and influence over our elected officials. Like those are all things that I think contribute to the disillusionment of society around civic participation and voting. But that being said, I also think that we have to be committed to the process, and the process is long and hard and messy. And so there is an element of there are certain things we need to continue to work to fight to change, but we also have to be committed to democracy as something that doesn't just happen on election day.
Thank you for that. Yes, I think that's very helpful to think about. Most things we have as Americans, there's so many ways that instant gratification is part of our, culture. And so the idea that you fill out your ballot or you stand in line and vote, and then maybe 2 years down the line, what you believe in can actually be realized is not second nature for people in this country. So that's a very helpful reminder.
And there's a lot of work that has to happen in between to actually make that happen. You don't just show up every 2 years and expect that, your vote will change the trajectory of the world if you're not willing to do the work in the in-between.
Ooh, that's true. That's so true. I mean, Stephanie really hit the nail. I always mess that up. Hit the nail on the head. Yeah, I always mess that up. But she was right. She said everything that needed to be said. I think we always talk about creating a culture of civic responsibility. So when we're talking about, the voting being a tool, it's not the only tool in the toolbox, right? That tool sometimes isn't enough to build a whole house. Like one tool isn't enough to build a whole house. You got to have multiple things. And to Stephanie's point, voting is one part of that, holding people accountable, being participatory in the process, creating things when we don't see those things, and also, being willing to reimagine and help, get us from point A to point B. That is a shared responsibility. And I think that sometimes voting is lifted as if once you do that, it's the silver bullet. There are just no silver bullets to democracy. It's a lot of work. And folk even, when you think about, curating something, right? We don't just show up and all the art is there. Somebody had to take time to, first of all, think through what the concept was going to be before they created the piece of art. Then someone comes in and decides what the space should look like and what the experience should be and all of these different things. So when I walk in, sometimes we can lose that it may have taken months and years to get to that one point where I can have that experience. And so it's the same thing with voting. It's the same thing with democracy. We're seeing sometimes the very last part or one part of the process, and we have to be thoughtful about the fact that all of it takes time and consistency and commitment. So that, Stephanie already really beautifully shared that.
Mm-hmm. A lot of hard work for us as voters in the United States and for you all. So thank you again for that. We have a question that says, how do you all personally foster engagement in democracy with the individuals that you mentor? So thinking about the next, the people you're wanting to see be leaders this next generation.
I think for me, this is really about paying it forward. It's as simple as that. I think, a lot of the people that I have mentored over the years have really been, a set of people who are likely like very first generation Latino, maybe not immigrants, but maybe their parents were first generation, or certainly maybe first generation college, first generation, kind of in this world of politics and campaigns when their parents maybe wanted them to be doctors or lawyers. And, I think one is instilling and continue to like instill the notion of like what public service can mean, and that working on a campaign or working on Capitol Hill or working in a state legislature or, at the state level or doing organizing in communities is an important way to be giving back to our community and building power for, Latino communities and other communities of color. And I think, with regard to, one of the things that I have learned in mentoring a lot of young people is that it is a very much a first generation of people coming into this work. We do not have long established networks of family and friends who have done this work before us. We're coming in new. And so really building the strength of that network of a community that can support one another and pay it forward for each other. So, as somebody who, might have mentored somebody 15 years ago, and now that person is a campaign manager, would I, or somewhere else high up in a campaign or an organization, like I'm always telling them, like always open the doors for other women, for other people of color. You are likely, one of few people of color at a table. And so your job is you're always going to be looked at as the person to represent, 32 million or 60 million Latinos in this country. But that being said, always identify, the person who can come up behind you, the person who you are mentoring in your organization or your space. Because I think that is a way that we continue to, again, build power for our community in a very concrete way. As we try to, build institutional power and representation.
That is such an important point, I think, especially for people of color, women of color. You hear about the crab in a barrel mentality. Like there can only be one, there can only be, one person in the room, one person at the table. And that's such a powerful message. It's not only your responsibility to do your work personally, but also to make sure that people who are coming up after you have the lessons that you had to learn on your own, or have the support from you and people who are leaders. So, and I know that, Stephanie, you're very involved in mentoring. So that's a really beautiful thing. Thank you.
Yeah, Maya Angelou said, come as one and stand as 10,000, right? I think that, to Stephanie's point, there is really no greater feeling of believing that the work will live beyond you than sharing that to that next generation, or sharing that with others who can take whatever, more so you're able to provide, and then wrap that in all of their own brilliance and genius and, expression, and then it lives, in the world in a different way. I think it's art in itself to do that. It is divinity in itself to do that, in my opinion. It's community to do that. I think that when at the root of why mentorship, especially in the spaces of democracy, is so important, is that a lot of these spaces have benefited from a white supremacy lens that says power is only for certain people, right? And when you disrupt that idea through things like mentorship and development, and Shirley Chisholm said, if y'all not gonna give me a seat at the table, I'm gonna stand, right? I'm gonna do whatever, I'm gonna bring my own chair, right? And so the point of the matter is that disrupts this idea that power has to be a certain kind of way and leadership has to look a certain kind of way. And Stephanie is so right. Sometimes we're in these spaces and you're like, I am one experience of how my community, or how a black woman lives in the world. I mean, I'm from Alabama, I'm Southern, you know, my dad's a pastor, you know, there's so many intricacies, and I'm like, I can't, you know, if you really think I can stand here and speak on behalf of a complete, you know, an entire, you know, race of people, wow, the pressure of that, number one, but the audacity of it is just sometimes overwhelming. But then you also realize the privilege of being in a space where you can bring those voices in, and it motivates you to try to, again, come as one and stand as 10,000. And so I think mentorship is absolutely critical. The last thing I will just say is that in a lot of our communities, particularly in the political.
Oh, I think we had a little hiccup with Daewana's connection. All right, I think we're a little frozen. Hopefully we can work out her technology quickly, but I'm so appreciative of that answer. It makes me think of what it must be to also be an elected official, to be expected to represent the views of your constituents, and you know, you have those voices in many ways coming to you and showing up and letting you know what people want. But if you're the one Latina at the table, the one Black person at the table, it is a lot of pressure to somehow represent the views of a very diverse and large community.
Well, what I will say is that kind of, you know, one of the things that the tragic events of the summer and the uprisings of the summer have really done is to really shift the conversation. In a lot of these rooms that I've been participating in, and, you know, conversations about diversity and inclusion and how we think about this work, the conversation has like markedly changed. And there is a, what is the word I'm looking for? There's a being seen of the African-American community, of the Latino community, of other, you know, communities that have been historically oppressed in this country, that I think people are much more attentive to and awake for now, that they're forcing themselves to ask the question and you know, prompt the conversation, and it doesn't feel as weighted toward, you know, the one, you know, African-American person in the room or Latino person, like, tell us your story, like, tell us, like, it, you know, because there is a burden that exists in a lot of these places that gets placed on the one or two people in the room to share their pain or to share their story, or to have to like convey that to the, you know, rest of the world, rather than putting the burden on, you know, the rest of your colleagues or community to be inquisitive and curious and to understand it themselves. And so I do think that that has been, you know, we're nowhere where we need to be by any means, but I have started to see more of a market shift in some of the rooms that I've been sitting in around how we have acknowledging who is not in the room, acknowledging the kind of work that we're doing, the impact on different communities that it's having, that, you know, I want to see continue to grow.
Mm. I'll ask one last question, and specifically to you, Stephanie. Well, oh, yay, we're back up. We're back up. Yay. Welcome back.
Okay. First ever.
Okay, so we'll do this last one for both of you. I'm curious what you think about this. Please provide suggestions on specific ways to bridge the divide between friends and family who have different political views. How could we begin to work as one?
Daewana, do you want to start with this one?
Oh, Lord.
I feel like I've been talking too much.
Me too. That's what I was like. I'm like, Stephanie, you go right ahead. That is a question that I have not had to answer in a long time.
Uh-oh, she froze at a good time. You froze again.
wanna
I'm
answer
like,
this
oh,
question. Let
that
me
you
just
froze
breathe.
at the right time, Daewana.
So, well, what I would say is that my relationship building, I think, is a process of both organizing. It's a process, you know, that we go through with politics, and it's something that I try to do with my own family and friends. Right? If the relationship is strained, it's hard to have a conversation on anything that might be polarizing. So the first thing I would just say is make sure your relationships are healthy so that you can have those conversations, and whatever practices you establish for those relationships, you know, have those moments where you can, you know, where you say, we're going to talk about something difficult, but create that safe space. And I think if you create the safe space for the conversation, that's the best place to do it, and to actually not have the conversation when you're already in conflict on something, right? It's just like, and I'm gonna take this to a completely different thing, but you know, in Alabama, where I'm from, there's the rival of the Alabama and Auburn football team. You come out the womb one fan or the other. It just kind of is what it is. But you, all through the year, if you wanted to have a conversation about Alabama and Auburn, it's fine. But on the day that they play, it is not the time to try to bring up why Auburn may be the worst or Alabama. Like, it's just not the time, because it's a high tense moment, right? And that's sort of the same thing with politics. It's not the time when, you know, to talk to, for instance, a member of the LGBT community when a trans person has just been, when a trans person has just been killed, you know, or it's not the time to talk to a woman when she might have just miscarried. It's not a time, like when those high tension points moments, it's not a time to talk to someone when they've been in that, like when they're in the moment of what that conflict might be. The time to talk about it is when, you know, you've sat back from that thing and you know, you're in a calm space and you can have a conversation about it. You just have to be thoughtful and strategic about doing it. But really it starts with the relationship. Cultivate the relationship in a way that you can have these hard questions. And that really works even with community. I mean, that's just good advice for community relationships, political relationships, whatever kind of space. Cultivate the space first, and then set some, you know, some tones and some strategies around how do we talk about hard issues. And then that's the way I've done it. And for the most part, I've stayed pretty safe, except for on Alabama and Auburn there.
The thing I would just add to that is that I think, you know, we have to remember one of the core capacities that we have as human beings, which is to listen, our capability to really listen and to be active listeners and hear and try to understand each other's pain and experience. Because for whatever reason, you know, if you support Donald Trump, there is something that you feel pained over. Like there is some, you know, and trying to understand, and trust me, like me even thinking about sitting down with somebody who can feel like they can relate to that human being is a very hard concept for me to even wrap my head around. But like, again, we have to go into this place of, you know, kind of our core human capacity of being listeners and putting ourselves in each other's shoes and having a human to human conversation, not one that is like built up with kind of all of the talking points and the armor that we've built around, I'm on this side and you're on that side. You know, I have a friend and colleague who tells a really beautiful story about her mom, who was a lifelong Republican. Somebody had voted for Ted Cruz in the 2016, you know, primary, and was very hardcore Republican. And this woman worked for Hillary Clinton. She's a very, very progressive person, actually. And, you know, she talks about how, you know, the way she convinced her mom to vote for Hillary Clinton, which was the first Democrat she ever voted for, was by talking to her about the kind of life she wanted for her daughter, and said that, like, for me, like, Mom, you are voting, by voting for Donald Trump, this is what it means for you to vote for Donald Trump and what it means for me and what you have been fighting for to build for me in terms of the life you wanted me to lead and for me to have access to, and put it in that context. And she was able to convince her mother to vote for Hillary Clinton by putting it in that context. And I think like that is the kind of, you know, it has to be authentic. We can't just make up stories like that and pretend that they're real. The part of the beauty of that was the authenticity of a mother and a daughter, a mother who had immigrated here, who wanted something very different for her daughter than she was seeing. And so I think like being able to personalize it in such a deep way is also another way to have those conversations, but only if we're really prepared to listen to the other side.
Wow. I think that both of you, your answers sound like really helpful life advice, not even just for politics. So thank you for inspiring me, and I'm sure many people this morning. I feel fired up for these coming few weeks as we approach the general election. Thank you so much again. We're going to close out. I appreciate your time this morning, and we also so appreciate the work that you do on a daily basis. So,
well, I am going to take you up on that tour of the LACMA whenever
that's
this
right.
you know, we would love to welcome you. Come on, anytime.
All right, thank you.
All right, thank you both.
Thank you all.